Jake jolted awake to the violent growl of heavy machinery outside his window. His heart pounded as he threw back the covers and rushed to the door. The moment he stepped outside, the crisp morning air did little to cool the fire already building in his chest. A bulldozer loomed over his newly built cedar fence, its engine roaring like a beast ready to tear into its prey. A cluster of men in hard hats stood nearby, chatting casually, while one of them adjusted the controls. But it wasn't the machinery that sent a sharp, electric current of fury through Jake's veins. It was the woman standing smugly at the forefront, arms crossed, her lips curved into the kind of smirk that practically dared him to challenge her. Karen. Jake had dealt with her before, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a woman who thrived on wielding power like a sledgehammer. If there was a single blade of grass growing half an inch too tall, she'd slap a violation notice on the door. If a car sat in a driveway 5 minutes past an arbitrary deadline, there'd be a fine. But this was a different level of insanity. Jake stormed forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. What the hell is going on here? Karen tilted her head, feigning surprise. Oh, good morning, Mr. Lawson. I see you finally decided to join us. She gestured grandly at the fence, as if she were unveiling a work of art instead of an impending disaster. Unfortunately, your fence is in violation of HOA regulations. I gave you ample notice, but since you failed to comply, we're having it removed. Jake stared at her, stunned. That's complete bullshit. I got approval from the city. This fence is completely legal. Karen's eyes gleamed with a sick kind of pleasure. The city doesn't run this neighborhood. The HOA does. And as president, I have the authority to enforce our rules. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself to keep his voice even. You can't just. A sharp whistle cut through the air as one of the workers signaled to the bulldozer operator. The engine revved louder and the blade lurched forward, slamming into the fence with a sickening crack. Wood splintered. Jake's stomach twisted. His hands balled into fists at his sides as rage bubbled over. Stop. You don't have the right to do this. Karen made a show of checking her nails. Actually, I do. Jake's mind raced, grasping for anything, some way to stop this. His phone. The police. He yanked his phone from his pocket, quickly dialing 911. Karen chuckled, tilting her head. Oh, by all means, call them. I'd love to explain how you're the one in violation. The arrogance in her voice was unbearable, but Jake ignored her, his jaw locked as the dispatcher answered. I need officers at my address immediately. Someone is illegally destroying my property. Even as he spoke, another crash echoed through the air. A section of his fence crumpled under the force of the bulldozer. A sickening mix of helplessness and fury coursed through him. Minutes felt like hours as he stood there, his teeth grinding, fists shaking. Then finally, red and blue lights flashed down the street. A squad car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. Relief washed over Jake like a tidal wave. He turned to them, his voice tight. They're destroying my property. I have city approval for that fence. They have no right to tear it down. The taller officer looked from Jake to the broken fence, then at Karen, who was already stepping forward with that infuriating air of self-importance. Officers, she said smoothly, this structure is in clear violation of HOA regulations. We have full authority to remove it. The second officer's brow furrowed. Do you have documentation proving this? Karen's smirk didn't waver. Our bylaws are very clear. The HOA's jurisdiction overrides city approval and community aesthetics. This fence was not approved by the board. Jake stepped forward, thrusting his phone toward the officer. I have emails, permits, everything proving this fence is legal. The officer studied the documents for a moment, then exchanged a glance with his partner. He exhaled, clearly hesitant. This is tricky. Normally, city approval would be final, but if the HOA has specific guidelines. Jake's stomach dropped. You're telling me they can just destroy my property? We can't make an immediate determination, the officer said. This might be a civil dispute. Jake could feel Karen's satisfaction radiating off her like heat from the sun. Unbelievable, he muttered. Karen clasped her hands together. Well, since this is clearly a legal matter and not a criminal one, I think we're done here. She turned to the workers. Continue. Jake's throat tightened as another ear-splitting crunch filled the air. His fence, his property, was being obliterated before his eyes. And there was nothing he could do. The officers lingered for another minute before one of them offered a half-hearted, "You should take this up in court," and walked back to their car. Jake stood there, his mind burning with frustration, helplessness, and something darker, something sharper. Karen stepped closer, her voice a low, smug murmur. Maybe next time you'll learn to follow the rules. Jake turned slowly, meeting her gaze with a cold, steady stare. Enjoy this while it lasts, he said, his voice deadly calm. Because you just made the biggest mistake of your life. Karen laughed, a dismissive, condescending sound. Oh please. What are you going to do? Complain? Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because deep down, beyond the rage, beyond the humiliation, something had already clicked into place. Karen thought she'd won. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. Jake spent the rest of the day staring at the ruins of his fence, his fury simmering just beneath the surface. The scent of splintered wood and freshly disturbed earth clung to the air, a bitter reminder of what had happened. He had never felt so utterly powerless before, watching something he had built be ripped apart while he stood there, shackled by rules twisted against him. But Karen had made one fatal miscalculation. She thought he would just accept defeat. That night, he sat at his desk, fingers drumming against the wood as his computer screen cast a cold glow across the darkened room. His mind churned, replaying the smirk on Karen's face, the arrogance in her voice, the way she had dismissed him as if he were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He needed leverage. With a deep breath, he started digging. The HOA's website was little more than a collection of outdated PDFs and self-congratulatory nonsense, but it was enough to give him a starting point. He pulled up their bylaws, scanning through page after page of convoluted legal jargon. And then, there it was. A section buried beneath layers of unnecessary clauses, stating that any changes to the HOA's governing rules had to be voted on by at least 70% of the homeowners. Jake narrowed his eyes. Karen had stood there, smugly declaring that the HOA had full authority. But when had they voted? Had anyone in the neighborhood actually agreed to these supposed regulations? Something told him they hadn't. His fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as he searched through public records, past HOA meeting minutes, old email correspondences, anything that could give him an edge. It didn't take long to find the first crack in Karen's armor. There were no records of a vote regarding fencing regulations. In fact, there were multiple instances where policies had been changed unilaterally by the HOA board without homeowner input. Jake exhaled slowly, a dark smile curling at the corner of his lips. That was illegal. It wasn't just a small technicality, it was a violation of state HOA laws. And that wasn't all. The more he dug, the worse it got. There were homeowners who had been fined into financial hardship over infractions that weren't even listed in the bylaws. People who had been bullied into repainting their homes for arbitrary reasons. One elderly couple had been forced to sell their house after the HOA slapped them with so many fines that they couldn't afford to stay. It was a pattern. A long, calculated abuse of power. And Karen had been at the center of it all. Jake leaned back in his chair, the weight of his findings settling in. This wasn't just about his fence anymore. The next day he knocked on his neighbor Greg's door. Greg was in his late 60s, a retired teacher with a sharp mind and a deep distrust of authority. He opened the door with a skeptical look, but when Jake mentioned the HOA, his expression darkened. "Come inside," Greg muttered, glancing around as if Karen had spies planted in the bushes. Over 2 cups of coffee at the kitchen table, Jake laid out everything he had found. With each piece of evidence, Greg's face twisted in disgust. "I knew they were pulling some shady stuff," Greg muttered. "But this is outright fraud." Jake nodded. "I need to talk to more homeowners. If we can prove Karen's been running this place like her personal kingdom, we can take her down." Greg didn't hesitate. "I'll make some calls." By the end of the day, word had spread. Homeowners came forward with stories that ranged from petty fines to outright intimidation tactics. One woman, Melissa, revealed that Karen had threatened to have her car towed for violating aesthetic standards. Another neighbor, Phil, recounted how he had been fined for a supposed unauthorized garden, even though he had photos proving the previous homeowner had planted it years before. Jake listened to each story, his anger growing with every new piece of information. Karen had spent years bullying people into submission, using fear and bureaucracy as her weapons. But now the tide was shifting. And he wasn't done yet. That night he met with a lawyer. The man was sharp-eyed and efficient, nodding as Jake laid out the case. "This is strong," the lawyer admitted, flipping through the documents. "With enough homeowner backing, you could file a lawsuit against the HOA for unlawful practices. Potentially even personal liability for Karen, depending on her role in all this." Jake's lips curled into a slow, satisfied grin. Good. 2 days later, Karen's reign started to crack. It began with a simple email, an official request for financial records and a formal challenge against the recent rule changes, signed by over 30 homeowners. Legally, the HOA was required to provide transparency. Ignoring the request would only make them look worse. Within hours, Karen responded. A single-line email, clipped and dripping with condescension. All HOA regulations are final and non-negotiable. Jake almost laughed. She had no idea how deep she was sinking. The following morning, a second email was sent, not from Jake but from his lawyer. This time the language was far less friendly. A formal demand for financial disclosures. A warning that failure to comply would result in legal action. And a reminder that state law overruled HOA bylaws when it came to voting requirements. Jake could only imagine Karen's face when she opened it. By noon, the HOA's official website mysteriously went offline. By evening, Karen was making frantic phone calls to the remaining board members. By the next morning, Jake received a notice in the mail. A $500 fine for community disruption. His laughter echoed through his house. Karen was panicking. And she had every reason to. Jake held the notice in his hands, the fine's bold red lettering standing out like a final desperate act of defiance. Karen wasn't just trying to maintain control, she was grasping at it, clawing at the power slipping through her fingers. The sheer audacity of it nearly made him laugh. Instead, he snapped a picture and forwarded it to his lawyer. The response was almost immediate. Retaliation. This strengthens our case. Sit tight. Jake didn't have to wait long. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Karen had called an emergency HOA meeting, something she hadn't done in years. She had always ruled through emails, official notices, and quiet, backdoor decisions. A public meeting? That meant she was nervous. And that meant Jake had already won. But he wasn't about to let her realize that just yet. When he arrived at the community center, the air was thick with whispered conversations. Homeowners huddled together in small groups, their voices hushed but urgent. Faces that once held silent frustration now gleamed with something new, hope. Karen sat at the front of the room, flanked by the remaining board members, her expression carefully neutral. But Jake could see the tension in the tight set of her jaw, the rigid way she held herself. She tapped her manicured nails against the table, a steady, impatient rhythm, as if she were trying to maintain control through sheer will alone. The moment the meeting was called to order, she launched into a prepared speech, her voice dripping with feigned authority. There have been some misunderstandings regarding HOA policies, she said smoothly, scanning the room as if she still believed she could sway them with empty words. Certain individuals have chosen to spread misinformation, creating unnecessary conflict within our community. Jake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, letting her dig her own grave. She continued, her voice steady but her eyes betraying flickers of unease. As HOA president, I have always acted in the best interest of this neighborhood. However, I understand that some of you have concerns, and I am willing to address them. Silence. Then Greg stood. His voice was sharp, cutting through the stale air. Then let's start with the financial records. Where are they? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen's mask didn't slip, but Jake saw the slight tightening around her eyes. The records are private, she said, her tone clipped. HOA funds are managed internally, as outlined in our regulations. Wrong, Melissa shot back from the other side of the room. State law requires financial transparency. And you haven't provided any. Karen's fingers twitched against the table, but she forced a tight smile. If there are concerns about finances, we can arrange a review. We already did, Jake interrupted, standing. He pulled out a folder and placed it on the table in front of him. I had a forensic accountant look into the HOA's expenses. Karen's face paled ever so slightly. Jake flipped open the folder, his voice steady and deliberate. Over the last 3 years, HOA dues have increased by nearly 30%. But there are no records of where that extra money has gone. No invoices. No receipts. Just large, unexplained withdrawals labeled as administrative fees. A sharp inhale from the crowd. Karen's smile faltered just for a fraction of a second. Jake wasn't done. And then there's the issue of the voting procedures. He turned a page, tapping his finger against the incriminating lines of text. You made multiple policy changes without a neighborhood vote. That's illegal. The room erupted into whispers, a rising tide of anger and realization. Karen straightened, her voice forcibly calm. This is absurd. These accusations are baseless. Jake cut her off. They're not accusations. They're facts. And we're taking legal action. A sharp intake of breath from the crowd. Karen's carefully crafted composure cracked, just slightly, as the full weight of what was happening began to settle on her. Then Phil stood. "We want a new vote. On everything." A chorus of agreement swept through the room. Greg nodded. Melissa added, "And we want full transparency. No more closed-door decisions." Karen's mouth opened then closed. For the first time she seemed truly lost for words. Jake took a step forward. His voice was calm, measured, but unyielding. "You spent years bullying this neighborhood. That ends today. Either you comply or we move forward with the lawsuit." Silence. A long, tense moment stretched between them. Then, finally, Karen exhaled sharply, her gaze darting around the room, searching for support. But there was none. The board members beside her shifted uncomfortably. The power she had wielded for so long was crumbling right before her eyes. And she knew it. The meeting adjourned in chaos, neighbors talking in hurried, excited voices. But Jake remained where he was, watching as Karen gathered her papers with tight, jerky movements. As she stood, he leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You thought you could bulldoze me," he murmured. "But you just destroyed yourself." For the first time she had nothing to say. And for the first time Jake knew he had already won. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The homeowners had spoken, and Karen's once unshakable authority was crumbling faster than she could grasp at it. Official paperwork had been filed. The lawsuit was in motion. And for the first time in years the neighborhood felt alive, not with fear but with something else. Something Karen had never allowed before. Oh. Jake watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. His inbox overflowed with messages from neighbors who had once kept their heads down, now emboldened by the shifting tides. Even the board members, once Karen's most loyal enforcers, were beginning to distance themselves from her. Like rats fleeing a sinking ship. And sinking she was. Then came the final blow. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Jake received an email from his lawyer. He read it once. Then again, slower, as a slow grin spread across his face. The state had opened a formal investigation into Karen's financial mismanagement. The missing funds? They weren't just an HOA issue anymore. They were a potential felony. The storm was about to hit, and Karen had nowhere to hide. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the community center was packed wall to wall. People who had never shown up before now filled every chair, standing along the back walls, waiting. There was no nervous energy this time, only anticipation. They all knew what was coming. Karen walked in late, and for the first time she didn't carry herself with that imperious confidence. Her usual perfectly pressed blazer looked stiff, her shoulders tense. The carefully composed mask she always wore was beginning to fracture. She sat at the head of the table, clearing her throat before speaking. "This meeting is called to." "We want your resignation," Greg interrupted from the crowd. The room fell into a thick silence. Karen's mouth pressed into a thin line. "That's not how this works." Jake stood, his voice calm but firm. "It is now." He stepped forward, holding up a folder, the final, undeniable nail in Karen's coffin. "We have proof of financial misconduct. The missing funds, the unauthorized changes, the intimidation tactics. We took it to the state." He let that sink in, then delivered the killing blow. "There's a formal investigation underway, Karen. This is bigger than an HOA dispute now. You're looking at real consequences." For the first time since this all started, Jake saw real fear flicker in her eyes. A murmur of shock swept through the crowd. Even the remaining board members looked blindsided, their gazes darting between Karen and Jake, realization dawning on their faces. Karen stiffened. "This is ridiculous. This is nothing more than a smear campaign." "You can step down," Jake interrupted, "or you can let this play out in court. Your choice." Karen's hands clenched into fists on the table. Her breath came faster now, her carefully constructed facade cracking like thin glass. She looked around, searching for an ally, someone, anyone, to back her up. No one spoke. Not a single voice rose in her defense. Her jaw tensed. Her fingers twitched. The weight of her crumbling empire pressed down on her, and for the first time in her reign she had no way out. Then slowly her shoulders slumped. The fight drained from her like air leaking from a punctured balloon. Her lips parted, but no words came. She swallowed, forcing a tight breath before she finally, reluctantly, spoke. "I resign." The room erupted into cheers, applause, exclamations of disbelief and triumph. Jake exhaled, feeling a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying finally lift from his shoulders. He turned to his neighbors, his allies, and let the victory wash over him. Karen rose stiffly, gathering her papers with jerky, mechanical movements. But before she could make her escape, Jake leaned in, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You spent years tearing people down," he murmured. "But the thing about bullies? Eventually they fall." Karen didn't respond. She didn't meet his eyes. She simply turned and walked out of the community center, her presence evaporating like a bad dream. The moment the doors swung shut behind her, Jake let out a breath. It was over. The HOA would be restructured. Transparency measures would be put in place. The fines, the harassment, the reign of unchecked power, it all ended here. Justice had been served. And it had never tasted sweeter.